Welcome back to this next episode of Chinwags with the OCC. The topic today is something very close to the heart of all MLROs. MLRO stands for Money Laundering Reporting Officer, a designated individual within a financial institution or organization responsible for overseeing and managing anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing efforts. The typical function of an MLRO would include, among others, developing AML, CTF policies and procedures, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing procedures, monitoring and reporting of financial transactions and activities, conducting ongoing risk assessments to identify vulnerabilities to mitigate these risks, and educating employees and staff members about the regulations and procedures. And the last I counted, the responsibilities have passed more than 10. So in the last 1 week, we have had some big news. The first one that has grabbed global attention being the success of the billion-dollar money laundering raid in Singapore. Also reported this week, UBS paid $1.4 billion to settle a US fraud charges in the sale of mortgage-backed securities from the financial crisis in 2008, and that was a long time ago. Being guardian of financial integrity involves a multitude of unspoken responsibilities that come from the role of the MLRO. In today's episode, I want to draw insights from the OCC, how we can effectively do our job, and what are the things they don't tell us about being an MLRO. I shall start with Mark, who has kicked off this conversation earlier before we started the recording. Over to you, Mark.
Yes, which is why I'm laughing, but it's not tears of joy. The MLRO role is one of the most important, complicated, and career-ending roles in any institution. There are 4 areas that I want us to talk on under Julia's guidance today, which don't get talked about. In another episode, we'll talk about some of the personal attributes that I think, and I'd love to hear everybody else's views, what MLROs actually need to succeed in a complex, fast-changing environment. But let's start with the reasonably controversial stuff. A lot of decent, hard-working professionals want to become MLROs because they want to do their bit to fight financial crime and to be the good guys and girls in an organization. However, because the MLRO tends to be a role defined both by regulation and law, depending on which country you are based in or where you're exposed to, there are 4 key things that people overlook. 1, the MLRO will be the person that the senior managers, the board management look to go, are we compliant? Your responsibility. And it's not too surprising. The front office, depending on the degree of work and access you have to them, will go business preventer until the moment after something goes wrong, in which case, oh, hello MLRO, we're your bestest friends in the world. An example of this would be a well-known Swiss banker who, after having been discovered taking diamonds that he had inserted into the toothpaste to travel across the United States with, was caught handing this over to one of his particularly corrupt contacts, claimed that the MLROs had never taught him that it was wrong to spend your morning sticking illicit contraband into other stuff to smuggle across a country. So you have your front office problem. Then you have your law enforcement relationship. You are their person inside the organization, and they will come to you with that expectation of full cooperation. Finally, there are the regulators, who are people who will design ever increasingly elaborate mousetraps together with brand new information systems and expect you to know them backwards, sideways, and indeed be responsible for all their failings. Julia, before I start boring for Britain on this subject, is that what you wanted to hear? Well, perhaps let me rephrase that. Not what you wanted to hear, but on target with your views?
Yeah, actually, I think based on what I've experienced in the past few years as MLRO, the regulators have definitely, as you mentioned, added more and more and requirements, and not to mention the bad actors have started to be even more creative as well. And so on the topic of fighting financial crime, maybe I'll also get some insights from Des on fraud, especially.
Yeah, sure. From what Mark said, there's two things that, well, one that he mentioned that I agree with. What is it about the MLRO, some of the things that they don't tell you about? There's always this phrase that I hear that says the MLRO should have a sufficient level of seniority within the relevant firm. I kind of may argue that in some of the companies that I see and whatever. And the second part is the MLRO should have sufficient resources, including sufficient time to support staff. Well, both of those, for me, in my opinion, are not always present in all the businesses that we've been involved in. For me, the MLRO role it's complex and varied anyway, requiring any individual who's taking that role to have a detailed knowledge of compliance. They probably also, in my opinion, need to be tech savvy. They need to be decisive, strong-willed, but you need to also be versatile and flexible. And I think that helps as well. The one other thing that is almost the unspoken part that, well, we haven't talked about it yet, is the fact that the criminal, the threat of prosecution hangs over the head of every MLRO like a sword of Damocles to a certain extent, and that's the big one that I look at. If I go back, I think it was 2015, 2016. The head of the financial crime department of the FCA, in a speech back in 2015, I think it was, talked about, he asked a question, which is what I'll just finish on before you can come back to me later. And his question was along the line of, is the criminal liability attached to money laundering reporting officer role doing more harm than good? Does it lead to overly conservative or defensive reporting, which muddies the water? So again, I know that's what I tend to do. I'll leave you with a question I don't expect an answer. Julia, what do you think?
Well, I think this is a really, really complicated topic, which then I'd like to get Nigel's opinion on this, given as speaking of prosecution.
I'm old. In fact, you may not realize it, but I'm considerably older than the other two here. And I was very much looking at these issues on the 1st of April, 1994, when the UK's money laundering regulations came into effect. Right from day one, when I was advising companies on the strategies that they needed to put in place, not so much on the detail. There are people that are better, like Des and Mark, at the detailed nitty-gritty of what happens within the company. I mean, I can write manuals and stuff like that, but I'm not suited. My personality is not suited to working with frontline staff and saying, you've got this right, you've got this wrong, this is how we do it. I'm a strategist. And I looked at all of the stuff that the Money Laundering Reporting Officer, the term originated from the UK, by the way, all the stuff that was imposed upon the Money Laundering Reporting Officer at that time was an actual fraction of what it is today. But also, companies didn't understand why it was important. They didn't understand what was going to be involved. So the very first seminar I gave, I had a junior accountant from quite a large company who'd been sent along because, well, it says money, so it must be for the accountants to deal with. I had from a large insurance company, the CEO's PA, delightful woman. Well, it looks like it's paperwork and you're good at that, so you can have it. This is where we started with money laundering reporting officers in 1994. The degree of knowledge, information, and skill that is necessary today is absolutely unrecognizable, or would have been unrecognizable at that time. So that's our first problem, is the job has changed massively, but it's only changed operationally, which is where it kind of gets me cross, because the job itself is exactly the same as it always was. Develop systems, including training and reporting systems, to detect and deter money laundering in particular, and to make reports to the FIU where there is suspicion. And that's still the job, or it should be. But today the job is protect us from the regulator. And increasingly, you are more likely to be in trouble with a regulator because often a kid. I mean, I've seen people who are interns on their work experience from university, who say, "I am supervising banks." That is just bizarre that they would even think that. I have been in inspections, particularly in insurance companies, where the question in the old days was, do you comply with the regulator's green book? And when my client said no, they had apoplexy. And so my client said, let me show you what the green book says, and let me tell you what our advice is that we should do. And then the inspector said, but you don't comply with the green book. Well, no, because we do a lot better. This is the problem with regulators, is they don't train their own people to understand not just ticking the boxes, but what's going on behind it. We are seeing gradually some improvements in qualitative assessment, but they do tend to be a bit cack-handed. This is the biggest headache that I see. Back in those early days, I said absolutely categorically, there is nothing on earth would make me be an MLRO. I am not in the least unhappy that I have stuck by that decision. And I have been offered some pretty impressive jobs, and I won't take them. Julia.
I think in the last episode, we talked about the convergence of fraud and money laundering. And to me, this is something that I totally resonate with how you feel, your sentiments about this, Nigel. Because, traditionally, there has always been the officers, compliance officers, and risk managers working across the entire organization, looking into the risk. But somehow or other along the way, this has been put into silos, where you have the compliance officer having a specific role dealing with the regulators, and then you have the risk management being dealt with separately by somebody else. Plus, the tools have changed. I can have a fraud detection tool, and in the compliance function, they have the transaction monitoring tools. Can't they be the same? But at the moment, they're not. And so you end up with having different people handling different areas when they should be looking at things more holistically. I think from that perspective, this is where I feel that there is so much to the role of a money laundering reporting officer. While it sounds like you're just doing money laundering related work, it should be about fighting financial crime. And that's my take on it. And I think there is a lot that we can talk about. What are the things that no one told me about before I accepted this job as an MLRO? It's actually quite daunting, and it definitely requires a village. a lot of supporting, a lot of support system around me, and also a lot of experience along the line. It's not just about having an education or certificate saying that I am certified to be a compliance officer. That is not enough. Maybe I'll pass it back to Mark for some closing remarks before we adjourn to our next episode, where we will want to talk a lot more about what it takes to be an MLRO, what kind of personalities would fit to be an MLRO. Mark?
Absolutely. It's one of the great fun bits of the OCC is listening to all these experienced professionals coming to roughly the same area of the world from very different backgrounds. Mindful of time, I'll keep it very brief. The nearest professional role outside banking that I can think of for an MLRO is somebody who deals with unexploded bombs or improvised explosive devices, because you will never know where the next thing that goes boom will be, whether it is internally generated, whether it is generated on the institution by bad actors or by an idiot regulator who doesn't know what they're looking at. All of these are risks that you are not told about and will be expected to participate in and possibly lead the management response on. So, as Julia said, next time we'll talk about personality traits and some of our experiences in this area. But if I had to give a tip to an MLRO, it would be know your Rudyard Kipling and the If poem. So by way of guidance, you could do worse than Rudyard Kipling's If as a poem. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you but make allowance for their doubting too, it's not a bad place to try and center yourself to be a good MLRO.
There's actually more to just knowing about your work, but also knowing your environment, what can be used as a tool for laundering money. So, yep, until the next episode, thank you.